Come on into the ditch. I'm your resident ditch witch, Tara Tyne, and we're about to get witchy, whether you like it or not. So I often get calls from people this time of year going, Tara, what do witches actually do at Solstice? The answer is nothing. Goodbye. The end. In truth, I can't speak for all the witches. I know of one witch who sits up all night the night before the winter solstice, just to make sure the sun comes up for us sleeping mortals the next morning. What have you done to make sure humanity doesn't have to spend eternity in perpetual darkness lately, And I used to do all that ritual stuff involving fire and offerings and occasional nudity. But as the years roll on in your witchhood, witchiness career, your efforts tend to decline somewhat. You tend to just end up incorporating slightly grander thoughts and memories into your daily ritual. So while I'm cleaning out and lighting my fire on the day of the solstice, I am thinking of my ancestors. That is both my recent ancestors, the ones who churned out endless streams of puddings and lifted their skirts to warm their arses by the fire. And she says to she, how's your puddings coming along? The ones from the turn of the last century who wore the Gibson girl hairstyles, who saw the birth of the Irish Free State through bloody rebellion, and who probably smuggled butter at some point in their lives. And also, the solstice makes me think of my ancient ancestors. I mean, living in Ireland, it's not hard to think of the ancients. I don't know if many of you have ever heard of the Newgrange monument down in County Meath. That is a Neolithic passage tomb, which is aligned with the rising sun on the mornings in and around the winter solstice. And what happens is the sun penetrates a little light box which is above the door. Rather a stylish decorative feature, or so you might think. No. This roof box sends the shaft of morning light up a stone passage which is 62 foot long. That's 19 meters for the rest of us. And this passage is not even straight, okay? There's a curve on this thing. Any of you who've ever been there know what I'm talking about. And somehow, around the winter solstice, every year, the sunrise travels the whole way up that passage and floods the tomb in the belly of the mound. It's epic, okay? I'd love to go there to see it in person, but it's only, the chosen few who are allowed into it. This year, however, there is an online event to watch it live as it's happening on the internet. So by the time this video goes out, I hope I manage to actually attend that event, and I hope that they continue to run it in later years. Far from taking away from the mysticism of the whole event, I actually think that opening it up to the masses is definitely the way forward. We don't really have Thanksgiving in Ireland, mainly because holidays that are connected to colonial invasions and genocide are sort of controversial here. But the winter solstice does absolutely make me give thanks, because thinking of my ancient ancestors back 5,000 years ago when Newgrange was built, and even up until 100 years ago, the frost wasn't just pretty and beautiful and slightly treacherous like it is for us now. The frost and the cold weather of Ireland was a very real threat to people this time of year, and I'm just really grateful to have a warm house. I know I complain about it being small, but it's easy to heat. No, it's not. But I do have a fridge full of food. I do have enough clothes, enough materials to do all the crafting I could possibly want to do. I have healthcare, I have the right to vote. The list goes on. I live in luxury compared to even my recent ancestors. So I think of them when I'm lighting my fire on the day of the winter solstice. And I like to think that maybe I would make them proud. Probably not though. Most of all, solstice reminds me that nature can kill me really bloody quickly if it wants to. Of course, this time of year generally is a time for being a child again as well. In my own childhood, it was very much a time for stories, and I think that's probably something that I would have in common with my ancestors, and probably all over the world. When the weather is cold and the nights are long, people shutting in and having stories and songs to entertain themselves is a pretty common theme the world over. For me, the actual literal branches on my Christmas tree were a huge source of inspiration. My mother had all these little hand-carved decorations or really unusual ones that she picked up over the years, and I remember thinking that the little collection of festive mice which hung from the branches all came to life at night and were having a party. And it's funny that just this year I find myself in possession of these cute little books which are actually illustrated and actually contain actual stories. These were also my mum's, a much more recent buy, I'd say genuine 1990s merch here. The stories appear to all be out of copyright. As such, I have used them to create a Christmas Eve radio show for Dundalk FM aimed at kids, 7 p.m. Christmas Eve, www.dundalkfm.com. And so I thought it would be maybe really nice to share one of these with you today, because this one that I just happened to pick off is my absolute favourite. A Christmas Carol. I think we can all agree that the Muppets did the absolute best version of this story. I think even Dickens would agree with that. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It will surprise you all very much to hear that there once was a man who did not like Christmas. In fact, he had been heard on several occasions to use the word humbug with reference to it. His name was Scrooge, and he was a hard, sour-tempered man of business, intent only on saving and making money, and caring nothing for anyone. He paid the poor, hard-working clerk in his office as little as he could possibly get the work done for, and lived on as little as possible himself, alone, in 2 dismal rooms. He was never merry or comfortable or happy, and he hated other people to be so. And that was the reason why he hated Christmas, because people will be happy at Christmas, you know, if they possibly can, and like to have a little money to make themselves and others comfortable. Imagine. Well, it was Christmas Eve, a very cold and foggy one, and Mr. Scrooge, having given his poor clerk unwilling permission to spend Christmas Day at home, locked up his office and went home himself with a very bad temper and with a cold in his head. After having taken some gruel, he sat over a miserable fire in his dismal room. He got into bed and had some wonderful and disagreeable dreams, to which we will leave him whilst we see how Tiny Tim, the son of his poor clerk, spent Christmas Day. The name of this clerk was Bob Cratchit. He had a wife and 5 other children besides Tim, who was a weak and delicate little cripple, and for this reason was dearly loved by his father and the rest of the family. Not but what he was a dear little boy too, gentle and patient and loving, with a sweet face of his own, which no one could help looking at. Whenever he could spare the time, it was Mr. Cratchit's delight to carry his little boy out on his shoulders to see the shops and the people, and today he had taken him to church for the first time. "Whatever has got your precious father and your brother Tiny Tim?" exclaimed Mrs. Cratchit. "Here's dinner all ready to be dished up. I've never known him so late on Christmas Day before." "Here he is, mother," cried Belinda. "And here he is," cried the other children, as Mr. Cratchit came in, his long comforter hanging 3 feet from under his threadbare coat, for cold as it was, the poor clerk had no top coat. Tiny Tim was perched on his father's shoulder with his little crutch in hand. "And how did Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold and better," replied his father. "I think, wife, the child gets thoughtful sitting at home so much. He told me coming home that he hoped the people in church who saw he was a cripple would be pleased to remember on Christmas Day who it was who made the lame to walk." "Bless his sweetheart," said his mother in a trembling voice. and the father's voice trembled too as he remarked that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty at last. Dinner was waiting to be dished up. Mrs. Cratchit proudly placed a goose upon the table. Belinda brought in the apple sauce, and Peter mashed the potatoes. The other children set chairs. Tim was, as usual, close to his father, and Tim was so excited that he rapped the table with his knife and cried, "Hurrah!" After the goose came pudding, with a great smell of steam like washing day as it came out of the copper. In it came, all ablaze, with its sprig of holly in the middle, and was eaten to the very last morsel. Then apples and oranges were set upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. And Mrs. Cratchit served round some hot sweet stuff out of a jug, as they closed around the fire and said, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears." "God bless us! God bless us, every one!" echoed Tiny Tim. And then they drank each other's health, and Mr. Scrooge's health, and told stories and sang songs. Tim, who had a sweet little voice, singing very well indeed, a song about a child who was lost in the snow on Christmas Day. Now I told you that Mr. Scrooge had some disagreeable and wonderful dreams on Christmas Eve. And so he had. And in one of them he dreamt that a Christmas spirit showed him his clerk's home. He saw them all gathered round the fire, heard them drink his health, and Tiny Tim's song, and he took special note of Tiny Tim himself. How Mr. Scrooge spent Christmas Day, we do not know. He may have remained in bed having a cold, but on Christmas night he had more dreams, and the spirit took him again to his clerk's poor home. Their mother was doing some needlework seated by the table. A tear dropped on it now and then, and she said, poor thing, that the work, which was black, hurt her eyes. The children sat, sad and silent, about the room, except Tiny Tim, who was not there. Upstairs the father, with his face hidden in his hands, sat beside a little bed on which lay a tiny figure, white and still. "My little child, my pretty little child," he sobbed, as the tears fell through his fingers onto the floor. Tiny Tim died because his father was too poor to give him what was necessary to make him well. "You kept him poor," said the dream spirit to Mr. Scrooge. The father kissed the cold little face upon the bed and went downstairs, where the sprays of holly still remained about the humble room, and taking his hat, went out, with a wistful glance at the little crutch in the corner as he shut the door. Mr. Scrooge saw all this, and many more things as strange and sad. The spirit took care of that. But wonderful to relate, he woke the next morning feeling a different man, feeling as he had never felt in his life before. "Why, I am as light as a feather, and as happy as an angel, and as merry as a schoolboy," he said to himself, as he absolutely skipped into the next room to breakfast, and threw on all the coals at once, and put 2 lumps of sugar in his tea. "I hope everybody had a Merry Christmas, and here's a Happy New Year to all the world." Poor Bob Cratchit crept into the office a few minutes late, expecting to be roundly abused and scolded for it, but no such thing. His master was there with his back to a good fire, and, actually smiling, he shook hands with his clerk, telling him heartily he was going to raise his salary, and asking quite affectionately after Tiny Tim. "And mind you make up a good fire in your room before you set to work, Bob," he said as he closed his own door. Bob could hardly believe his eyes and ears, but it was all true. Such doings as they had on New Year's Day had never been seen before in the Cratchits' home, nor such a turkey as Mr. Scrooge sent them for dinner. Tiny Tim had his share too, for Tiny Tim did not die, not a bit of it. Mr. Scrooge was a second father to him from that day. He wanted for nothing and grew up strong and hearty. Mr. Scrooge loved him, and well he might. For was it not Tiny Tim who had unconsciously, through the Christmas dream spirit, touched his hard heart and caused him to become a good and happy man? The end. I think the moral of the story here is to be a little bit less like Scrooge and a little bit more like his nephew Fred, who seems to carry around a spare Christmas wreath in case of wreath emergencies. Happy Solstice to you all. I have one more video out on Christmas Eve, which is going to be a tour of Dundalk's tastiest delicacies for Christmas. Hit subscribe for more fun and witchy adventures. I'm uploading 2 videos every week for the whole month of December. Slán agus Bannacht. Goodbye and good luck to you. Hurrah! Hurrah!